Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game. And today we're going to talk about my TGT Budget Aggro Rogue deck. This is a deck designed for brand new players to the game. If you're a beginner and you don't have many cards and you don't have much arcane dust to craft them with, and you want to play Rogue, then this deck is designed for you. The total crafting cost on this deck is only 600 dust, so even for those brand new players, it's something you can put together relatively quickly and relatively easily, and will still give you a solid performance on the ranked ladder. This is the kind of deck that won't take you to Legend, but it can get you a good start on the way to rank 15, maybe even rank 12 or rank 10, if you're really dedicated and learn the ins and outs of all your meta matchups. So the overall strategy with the TGT Budget Aggro Rogue is really in the name with the word aggro. This deck is almost even a face deck in that it's designed to pump out as much damage as is humanly possible and as quickly as possible against your opponent's face. So there are a lot of charge cards, there's a lot of damage buffing cards, and you want to push down your opponent's health pretty fast with this deck, or you'll run out of steam because you'll notice that there is no late game. The most expensive card is only a 4-drop, so you can't afford to play it slow and easy with this deck. You have to get minions onto the board, attack the face, use your weapon for damage, buff up your minions with various buffing spells, and squeeze out every extra ounce of that damage that you can to sneak out wins before your opponents have time to clear your board or react. There are also some pretty crazy combo potentials of this deck with things like South Sea Deckhand and Tinker Sharp Sword Oil. So it's not impossible to do something like 17 to 20 damage just from the cards that are in your hand. So this deck can do a lot of different things and win in a lot of different ways as long as you stay focused on destroying the enemy as quickly as possible at the cost of ignoring their board. So before we get into mulligans and upgrades, first I want to just run card by card, and since this is designed for new players, describe what every single card in this deck does and why it's included. So starting off with Cold Blood, this is a 1-mana spell that buffs a minion. If you use it non-comboed, it's going to give that minion 2 attack. If you use another card before this card, on the same turn, it's going to have that combo effect that gives a minion 4 attack instead. So when you want to do face damage, a buff that does 4 extra damage instantly for 1 mana is pretty fantastic to have. And it combos well with something like a South Sea Deckhand that has charge, or any minion that you're able to stick on the board. You can pump out a surprise 4 damage. You'll never want to use that damage to clear off an enemy minion. You should always use it to go to the opponent's face. Up next is another 1-mana spell. This time around it's Deadly Poison. This gives your weapon plus 2 attack. Now as a rogue, your weapon is going to be from your hero power. You'll notice there are no actual weapons in this deck. So this essentially, anytime you hero power, makes that 1 attack weapon a little bit better, making it a 3/2. And this is just a way to squeeze out an extra 4 damage for 1 mana, much like Cold Blood. It can be used to clear really pesky minions in the early game if necessary, but better off you're usually better off to send it to the enemy's face as well. Up next is Leopardome, a 1-mana minion. It's a 2/1 and it has a death rattle that deals 2 damage to the enemy hero when it dies. So this is the ideal card you want to get out on turn 1 right off the bat. If they don't have an answer for it, Leopardome typically will hit them for at least 4 damage and sometimes even 6 or 8 damage. If you get a Leopardome that does 6 or 8 damage, you're in awfully good shape to win the game. So getting this out early can be a huge advantage. We have another 1-mana minion in South Sea Deckhand. This has charge while you have a weapon equipped. So this is fine as a turn 1 play. You don't have to play it with charge. It's just fine as an early game board presence minion. But it can be used as well in the late game when you have your hero power weapon equipped as a vehicle for buffs like Cold Blood and Tinker's Sharp Sword Oil. So you can drop it out for 1 mana, activate all your combo effects, and get 4 damage here and another 3 damage here, and suddenly it's a 9 attack minion that's hitting with your weapon. So you can do something like, 15, even 20 damage if everything lines up and you have a full mana pool, just from cards in hand. So not only is it an early game minion, it's actually a late game finisher as well, just because that charge effect can be really, really powerful. Up next is Eviscerate, 2 mana spell. It does 2 damage at its base, and when it's comboed, it does 4 damage. There's nothing surprising about this card. It's just 4 more damage you can send right to the enemy face. You really shouldn't be using this to clear minions off the board unless it's a taunt that's in your way. You want to save this up for late game situations where you can send this behind a taunt and still do damage if your minions are kind of stuck and can't get lethal for you. Another 2 mana spell, Sap. This spell returns an enemy minion to your opponent's hand. This is not something you want to have in the early game because you can't play it on curve and you don't want to waste it on your opponent's cheap minions, but it's absolutely fantastic if they have a big threat in the mid to late game and you're trying to finish them off and there's a taunt in your way or just something that's going to trade efficiently with a high value minion of yours. You can sap it to cost them a ton of tempo and get any taunts out of the way to allow you to push for lethal at the same time. Up next is another 2 mana spell, third in a row. This time it's Shiv. This one does 1 damage and draws you a card. So 1 damage is not exactly a lot for 2 mana in this deck. That's not what we'd call efficient damage. But this one also draws you a card. And this deck can have a tendency to run out of steam pretty early on. So being able to ping something for 1 damage can be nice if you need to clear a pesky minion out of the way. And it's really the goal is to refill your hand efficiently. So having another charge minion, for instance, in a late game top decking situation, if you Shiv into a Wolf Rider, that's 4 damage to the face that keeps you in the game and maybe even nets you a lethal. So this is not something you want to see in the mulligan or in your early hand, but it's still a nice to have. Up next is Acidic Swamp Ooze, a 3/2 2-mana minion that has a battle cry that destroys your opponent's weapon. So against some classes like Paladin or Warrior or even Hunter, if they're clearing off all your minions very efficiently with a single weapon, it can be pretty devastating. So playing an Acidic Swamp Ooze that destroys that weapon and prevents them from making really, really tempo-favored minion clears can be a huge advantage. It's also just a nice 3/2 body on turn 2. Even if you're playing against a non-weapon class, this is just a moderately scary 3-attack threat to get on the board in the early game that they can't ignore, that sets up your future minions. Up next is Bluegill Warrior. This is a 2-mana 2/1 with charge. This is really just a second Southsea deckhand that's not conditional. It does the exact same thing as Southsea deckhand. It costs a little bit more mana, but it's just another charge minion that you can send straight to the face, packing some of these attack buffs from Cold Blood or Tinker Sharp Sword Oil. Up next is another familiar 2/1 minion. We have a lot of those. This time it's a Loot Hoarder that's 2 mana, and when it dies, it draws you a card. This essentially just combines your Shiv with your Southsea deckhand. It's a body that requires an answer from your opponent. They can't just let it sit out there and do 6 damage over 3 turns. They have to kill it, so they have to waste some damage or a minion or a weapon charge. But it also draws you a card, refilling your hand in the process. So it's just kind of a good combination of these other early game things we have happening. Up next is a new card from the Grand Tournament. This is the Undercity Valiant. This is another 2-mana 3/2. This time around, though, when you combo it out, it does 1 damage. So this is kind of a poor man's SI7 agent. And since this is a budget deck, we're definitely favoring the poor man here. This is just another good card that's a solid early game body. The combo effect can be used to ping off something that's going to make an efficient trade. It can also just be used as an extra 1 damage on the face. There will be games where you really, really wish you had that extra 1 damage that Undercity Valiant can provide. So don't underestimate the effect of this card. Up next is a 3-mana spell, Fan of Knives, does 1 damage to all enemy minions and draws a card. This is really one of the only cards in this deck that isn't all about hitting the enemy's face. This only affects enemy minions, but there are a lot of decks around these days that have a prevalence of 1/1s. For instance, Paladins, even Druids now have 1/1s. So having an efficient area of effect clear spell like Fan of Knives can really do a lot of work to preserve your other minions in the early game. You don't want 3 Silverhand recruits from a paladin killing off your leper gnome and your loot hoarder and your bluegill warrior. So Fan of Knives can help protect those pretty easily. It also cycles you a card, which is good if you happen to draw this in the late game and you're really digging for lethal threats. Up next is another 2/1 minion, another one that has charge. This time, though, it's 3 mana, Argent Horse Rider, brand new in the Grand Tournament, and this one has the benefit of Divine Shield. So this is a 2/1 with charge that's really hard for your opponents to deal with. Typically, they'll have to use 2 things to kill it. I mean, 2 minions, or maybe a hero power and a minion, and that drains their resources, drains their tempo, and you still get the charge damage from it immediately. So if you use your Argent Horse Rider with a Tinker Sharpsword or Cold Blood, it can do a ton of work, right? It can ping for, it can hit for 7, 8, 9 damage right off the bat, and then if they have to run a 6 health minion into it, it can also kill that for free thanks to that Divine Shield. So it's yet another charge minion, but this time with a pretty hefty advantage. Another 3 mana charge minion. I'm sure you've noticed the trend here so far. This is absolutely a face deck. Is the Wolf Rider. This is a basic card, totally free. It's 3 damage this time around, still only 1 health. And it's just a really good way to hit them for 3 damage. Plus, you'll notice we have so many things with 1 health so far. Pretty much every minion so far has had 1 health. So by the time you're playing Wolf Riders in the mid game, they're going to run out of ways to ping off all these 1 health minions. You've already dropped 3 or 4 things. So they either have to use really expensive removal on this, or make inefficient trades on your Wolf Rider to kill it, and you're still getting that 3 damage right off the bat. So you can see why it's advantageous. Up next is a 4 mana spell, and this is really your kind of big finisher and the card that gives this deck enough late game punch to survive into the mid game and still eke out wins. This is Tinker's Sharp Sword Oil. This gives your weapon +3 attack as a base effect, so in other words a bad deadly poison. But if you combo it, it also gives a friendly minion 3 attack. So you're kind of combining Cold Blood and Deadly Poison into one card. And admittedly, it's a little bit expensive, but when you have all these charge minions and you have your hero power weapon equipped most of the time, you're going to be able to do a lot with this thing. It's essentially 6 damage guaranteed right off the bat. If you count in 2 weapon attacks, it's a 9 damage card for 4 mana. If you happen to get multiple attacks with a minion on it too, it can even be a 12 damage card for 4 mana. The potential is almost limitless, and usually this will be enough to give you the damage you need for wins. And finally, we have a couple 4 mana minions to finish off this deck list. Piloted Shredder is the first one. This is a 4 mana 4/3 that summons a random 2-cost minion when it dies. Piloted Shredder is just an absolutely fantastic minion across the board that can fit into almost any deck. It's super sticky and annoying to deal with. It's got a strong 4 attack, so it adds up fast if they leave it alone. Even if they kill the first half of Piloted Shredder, it leaves another minion on the board, which sets up nicely for buffs from Cold Blood or Tinker Sharp Sword Oil. So it can do a lot of different things, and it can do them very, very well. This is a fantastic 4-drop. If you get it on curve, it's fine in the late game too. It trades well with scary things that your opponent might have. So Piloted Shredder is pretty much the perfect card to play on curve in this deck. And then finally, a very unusual recommendation. The final slot here is taken by Stormwind Knight. This is a 4 mana 2/5 with charge. I'm not sure I've ever seen Stormwind Knight in a competitive deck. I rarely ever even see Stormwind Knight in Arena. It's considered a pretty low tier card, typically, but I like what it does. You'll notice we have a lot of charge minions here. Stormwind Knight is a charge minion, though, that has a fair health pool, which makes it pretty solid for Cold Blood or Tinker Sharp Sword Oil buffs. If you buff it with Tinkers, it suddenly becomes a 5/5, and that's pretty tough for your opponent to deal with. So you can get something like 6 or 5 damage right off the bat when you buff this, thanks to its charge effect. And then your opponent still has to deal with a 6/5 or a 5/5. So they're going to either make terrible trades or be forced to leave it on the board for 2 turns, which means it could be a 10 damage card for 4 mana. It's just a body that allows you to stick buffs on it, and it's a sturdy body that has charge, which is hard to find in Hearthstone. So compared to like a Wolf Rider, for instance, for only 1 additional mana, you're getting 4 health. You're only losing 1 damage. But since a lot of our damage is going to come from those buffs, it's a pretty neat trade. So Stormwind Knight actually finishes off the deck. So now that we've ran through all the cards, I want to talk about mulligans real fast. This deck you absolutely have to mulligan well. If you keep the wrong things in your opening hand or you get too greedy, you will not survive. You will be eaten alive. You won't have the early game that you need to set up for your mid game. So, how do you mulligan in this deck? It's really pretty simple. You want minions above all else, and you desperately want 1-drops and 2-drops, and you throw back anything that is either a spell or costs more than 2 mana. So in other words, you don't need to keep Deadly Poison, you don't need to keep Cold Blood, even though they're cheap. You definitely don't want Sap or Shiv. You don't need Eviscerate in the early game, even though it's only 2 mana. You don't want any of these cards, 3 and above, because they're just way too expensive. So that leaves us with a few different things. Leper Gnome and Southsea Deckhand are your absolute priorities as 1-drops. Leper Gnome taking the first overall spot. If you get 2 Leper Gnomes, you're in great shape. Keep them both. As far as 2 mana cards are concerned, Acidic Swamp Ooze is totally conditional. If you're playing against a weapon class, you should absolutely keep it. Bluegill Warrior is not your best tempo play since it costs an extra mana and does the same thing Southsea Deckhand does essentially. You'd rather have a Loot Hoarder at your 2 mana slot. So keep Loot Hoarders over Bluegill, but they're both fine if you don't have 1-drops. Undercity Valiant is a pretty good 3-drop. It's not actually a 2-drop. Sometimes it's even a 4-drop because you want to get that combo effect off of it. It's typically better a little later in the game. You don't normally want to play this on turn 2 unless you have the coin. This can be a pretty cool turn 1 play with the coins. You can coin this out on turn 1, maybe kill like an enemy Leper Gnome or Silverhand Recruit or anything like that. So keep that in mind. If you have the coin, Undercity Valiant gets a little bit better. So mulligan priorities for me would go Leper Gnome, Southsea Deckhand, Loot Hoarder, Bluegill Warrior, and then conditionally Acidic Swamp Ooze if they have weapons, or Undercity Valiant if I have the coin. Otherwise, you don't want to see any of this stuff in your opening hand. You're in really bad shape if you end up with a Sap and a Shiv and a Fan of Knives. That's bad. You're going to have trouble winning. So be greedy. Don't just accept an okay opening hand. Look for the perfect start because that's what's going to win you games. So, now that you know the strategy, the card-by-card analysis, and the mulligan, I know I like to see, as a new player, some replacements. I want to hear about upgrades. How do I take this beginner deck and make it even better so that I can go beyond rank 15 and maybe even look at rank 10 or rank 5, even legend someday if I want to keep upgrading this deck. So I've gone through and I've identified a few different upgrades that I think will make this deck even better. So, up first is a let's just search here. We're gonna look for I never know how to turn those off. Arcane Golem. Oh, I think I have a filter turned on. I'm not seeing what I want to see. Okay, that's the problem. Forgive my snafu. There we go. Up first is a 3-mana Arcane Golem. This is another charge card, but it's a 4-damage charge card for only 3 mana, making it a distinct upgrade over Wolf Rider, but it has one penalty, and that is you give your opponent a mana crystal. Now, that's a pretty big penalty. It allows your opponent to get out more expensive stuff even faster. But with this kind of deck, you can typically afford to give them that even on turn 3. You're pumping out so much damage that 1 extra mana is not going to necessarily lose you the game. Now, of course, the later in the game you play this card, the better, because they don't benefit from the mana as early and over as many turns. So it's not, for instance, a turn 2 coin Arcane Golem. That's not a solid play. But a turn 5 Arcane Golem in combination with something else is just fine, and it gives you tons of damage. It packs such a big punch for only 3 mana. So I would actually recommend that you take out our beloved Stormwind Knight and swap in an Arcane Golem as soon as you get the chance. Now, I will say that Arcane Golem is not a card you find in a ton of decks, so crafting it could penalize you in a way. It's almost a waste of dust outside of this deck and maybe a couple other edge cases in aggro or face decks. So be careful there, but it would make this deck, in fact, much better. So another card I think would make this deck better is the Rogue's 3 mana SI7 Agent. This bad boy is a 3 mana 3/3 that has a combo that deals 2 damage. Now, SI7 agents are just the ultimate value 3-drop. They have a great body. They have a fantastic effect here with the combo. And like I said before, this is kind of the rich man's Undercity Valiant. So you'll see for only 1 extra mana, you get an extra health and an extra damage on that combo effect. So it's a fantastic upgrade. And this fits well in this deck. It's got the 2 damage, which can ping off an enemy threat if necessary, can hit the enemy's face. It's a solid 3/3 body that they have to deal with. So not only does it fit in this deck, but it fits in pretty much every rogue deck as the ideal 3-drop. So I recommend replacing your Undercity Valiant and a Wolf Rider with the SI7 agent. That's just going to give you a little bit more early game depth and answering potential. Another card that would be pretty interesting in this deck, and it would give you just a little bit more late game, really more mid game, and that is Loatheb. This is a 5 mana 5/5 that has the battle cry, enemy spells cost 5 more next turn. So with decks like this where you are trying to get minions out onto the board and you want them to stick around a turn or two, and you've got 2 or 3 minions at once often, it's really good to follow that up with a Loatheb, because your enemy is going to want to use a board clear spell to kill off all your minions. So they want something like a Blizzard or a Flame Strike or a Holy Nova to kill everything you've got, even a Consecration from Paladins, right? And Loatheb prevents them from doing that. So he can be like the ultimate 5-drop finisher that establishes a strong body and leaves your opponent without any options to counter you. That's really, really good to have. Now, Loatheb doesn't make it into this deck. He is a legendary and a part of the Naxxramas set, so you will have to play through that Wing and Naxxramas to unlock him. But I always recommend you play the Adventures for all the cards anyway, and this is a really, really strong one that fits not only in this deck, but in many, many other decks. It's just an all-around solid 5-drop, and frankly, still one of the best cards in the game. So the final recommendation I have turn on our filters here is the 2 mana spell Blade Flurry. This destroys your weapon and deals its damage to all enemies. So with this deck, we have a few different ways to buff our weapon, right? We got Deadly Poison that gives it 2 attack, and Tinker's Sharp Sword that gives it 3 attack. That means having a 6-attack weapon isn't that rare, and it's even more common to have a 3-attack or a 4-attack weapon. And what Blade Flurry allows you to do is attack with your weapon once for, let's say, 6 damage, and then you cast Blade Flurry, and that weapon is destroyed, doing 6 damage to absolutely everything on the other side of the board, minions and the enemy face alike. So it can be used as a board clear to kill off everything your opponent has, and it still does damage to their face, making it kind of the ultimate damage card, especially when we have all these weapon buffs in our deck. So you can use it to get through taunts. You can just use it for that final burst. It allows you essentially to attack twice with a weapon in 1 turn for only 2 mana. It's really, really strong in this deck. It's used in a lot of different rogue decks as well. So as a rare card for 100 Arcane Dust, it's a really good investment and gives this deck a lot of extra reach and lethal potential. So I would take out 1 Shiv and 1 Bluegill Warrior and swap in 2 Blade Flurries as soon as I was able to make this deck even better. So that's it for my TGT budget rogue. I hope you experiment with this deck and have some fun with it. It can do some crazy things once you learn all the ins and outs and the combo potentials and ways to find lethal damage. So it's really good to learn the game and keep an eye out for lethal at all times because you want to kill your opponent. Remember, that is the ultimate goal. So good luck out there on the ladder with this deck. I hope it takes you to rank 15, maybe even rank 10 with some practice and some patience. I really appreciate your time, and until next time, game on.